We light this chalice as a symbol of the spark of life which abides within us and around us. May it be as a light in a dark night, a light in a window that welcomes the weary traveler home. May it be as a light in the hand of a trusted friend that guides us along the path. May it be as the light in the face of one we love. And these are our opening words for this morning. Great occasions do not make heroes or cowards. They simply unveil them to our eyes. Silently and imperceptibly as we wake or sleep, we grow strong or weak. And at last, some crisis shows what we have become. For this morning's meditation, really happy that Bonnie will be singing and performing during the meditation. Excuse me. And I ask that as she's singing, you really listen to the words of the song and take some deep breaths right now. Breathe in deep for a few moments and hold it and breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. And let's enter together a spirit in a place of contemplation and peace while Bonnie plays.
In this holy, chaotic world, may we never lose sight of the miracles that are all around us, within us, and right beside us. When I was a child each week, on Sunday we would go to church, pay attention to the priest, and he would read the holy word. He'd consecrate the holy bread. Everyone would kneel and bow. Today the only difference is everything is holy now. Everything is holy now. And when I was in Sunday school, we could learn about the time Moses split the sea in two, and Jesus made the water wine. I remember feeling sad. Miracles don't happen still. Now I can't keep track, 'cause everything's a miracle. Everything's a miracle. Wine from water is not so small, but an even better magic trick is that anything is here at all. So the challenging thing becomes not to look for miracles, but finding where there isn't one. When holy water was rare at best, it barely wet my fingertips. Now I have to hold my breath. It's like I'm swimming in a sea of it. Used used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-downs. I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now. Read a questioning child's face. Say it's not a testament. That'd be very hard to say. See another new morning come. Say it's not a sacrament. I tell you that it can't be done. This morning outside I stood, I saw a little red-winged bird shining like a burning bush and singing like a scripture verse. It made me want to bow my head, 'cause I remember when church let out and how things have changed since then. Everything is holy now. It used to be a world half there, heaven's second-rate hand-me-downs. But I walk it with a reverent air, 'cause everything is holy now.
Thank you, Bonnie. I'm going to share, excuse me, I'm going to share our slide for our reading today. I'm going to try to. There we are. This is by Sue Monk Kidd. Reflection is in many ways a lost art. It's an eyepiece to a world hidden away, the world within ourselves, which is alive with truths and beauties and darkness we have never glimpsed. It seems sad that we slice our time too thin for dreaming long dreams and thinking long thoughts. We've grown uncomfortable with that sort of thing. For a long time, I had been uneasy, left alone. I'd snap on the television or grab a book or make brownies, anything. I suppose we're all restless, all alone with ourselves, all alone in a room with a stranger. What if we face ourselves and find we don't like the person we meet? I didn't even want to spend much time in prayer because God might confront me and I'd have to look at myself. I'm, of course, very excited to be able to introduce Delma Jackson. We're really fortunate or blessed, depending on your inclination, to have Delma with us this morning. And as always, I know that we can expect his gifts of humor and candor and wisdom. And with that, Delma, I'd love to hear what you have to say about all of this craziness going on.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, David. Thank you all. Um, it is definitely good to be back, even in this format. Um, yeah, I don't, it feels like a lot of pressure, David. Thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to be here with you all in community, even if virtually. And I don't suspect I'll take up too much of your time. Um, but thank you again for allowing me to be here with you all this morning. I wanted to just offer up a moment of silence in order to remember those who we have all, most of us know of, even if indirectly, someone who we've lost to this recent pandemic. And so I just wanted to offer up first just 60 seconds of virtual silence. And then from there, I will go into the message. So I will time that 60 seconds starting now. Thank you. To this, at this point, I've lost two folks that both of them happen to be childhood friends of mine that I hadn't really spoken to in a long time, but got word through social media that we had lost both of them to the pandemic. And I'm sure I'm not the only one being impacted by that. And one of the things that I have definitely watched in myself is moving from a place of thinking about the pandemic from a very theoretical space to one that has become far more personal and more visceral to me as a result of losing them. And so what seemed to be out there has very much become within, right? And so I'm probably not the only person that that's true for. And so I just wanted to name that. I wanted to spend some time today thinking about who we are in relationship to crisis and how we tend to show up for ourselves and one another during this time. So the first thing I wanted to offer was just a few quotes to open up and to kind of frame the conversation. The American author C.J. Redwine said, "Losing your head in a crisis is a good way to become the crisis." The Canadian author Eric Walters notes that crisis doesn't change people, it reveals them, right? And lastly, I wanted to share a snippet from Lewis Carroll, who wrote both Alice in Wonderland as well as Through the Looking Glass. And it was just a snippet of dialogue where Alice meets for the first time the caterpillar. And the caterpillar asks her, "Who are you?" And in response to that, Alice says, "I know who I was when I got up this morning, but I think I must have been changed several times since then." Right. So when we're talking about reflection, as always, big fan of etymology, and always interested in what an etymology can reveal about a particular word we use, and intends to stretch it out a bit and help us deepen our understanding. So in terms of reflection, Latin in root, as so many of the words that we use are, right? The prefix re, speaking to the notion of being bent, or backward or back. And then flectere, to bend, right? And so both of them kind of speak to the notion of bending, much as we get our reflection from mirrors, in part because mirrors are manipulated in their construction and bent to be able to speak back to us. And with that, I would offer the notion of reflection as a way of taking a moment to remember the elements that make us who we are when we're at our best, as a methodology for being grounded, which is something I'll speak to a little more a little later. So a couple things, just on a personal note. I have this memory of reading something written by, believe his name was Romano, who was the creator of one of the original pop culture icons in the late 60s, Night of the Living Dead. And one of the things that he talked about that I found really interesting was this idea that years after his movie had been a big pop cultural icon, and there have been so many other, zombie-based films, to the point where by the time he was talking about this, the sort of movie he offered had become just such a ubiquitous symbol and reoccurring theme in pop culture and in movies. And in thinking back on his initial offering, one of the things he noted was that it is typically during times of great social change and upheaval that we as a culture tend to kind of hone in on this particular mythology. And in thinking about what it is about social upheaval, he noted that in kind of this like in-group, out-group dynamic, it's often fear-driven, right? Fear of the other. And what makes the zombie film so popular is that it's one of those times where the other and the self become blurred, right? And so when he initially offered Night of the Living Dead, it was in the late 60s, in a time where obviously the US was eating itself from the inside out, right? And I use that term purposefully, right? And so the idea that anyone around us could be a threat, right? It's one thing to kind of put all of our emphasis and focus, and during the Cold War, for instance, oh, it's the Russians, it's China, right? It's them. But when America is under social upheaval, then the them becomes the us. And it can create so much fear, so much consternation. And you don't know who to be afraid of anymore. You don't know who to trust anymore. And there's a sense of something being destroyed from the inside out. And I was thinking about that recently because I have, during this time, become re-engaged with the AMC long-running series now, The Walking Dead. And I thought about Romano's work because during this time, I don't think it's a coincidence that I'm so re-engaged with this story now. Because I think what it does, it's never really been about the zombies, right? It's always about the survivors. It's always about the choices that tough times force us to make and the ways in which tough times can take us and change us into people that we may or may not recognize anymore. And there's something really powerful in that. And so that leads me into a story. And I wanted to, before I share a piece of that, share with you all. A lot of what I wanted to share today was rooted in a blog that I wrote recently for my job at the Center for Whole Communities. And I just wanted to share that. So it's actually, I just posted it in the chat. And if you feel so moved, feel free to take a look at that when it's convenient for you to do so. But what I opened up with in that particular blog was a story. I was, not too long ago, on a flight. And it was a short stint coming from the West Coast through Chicago and then flying into Flint. And the Chicago to Flint flight is super quick, 30 minutes, 45 minutes tops. But there are always these really tiny planes where you feel like everyone needs to get outside and help, start the start the engine or propellers, right? Super tiny, little rickety, a little nerve-wracking, flying over that sea of a lake in between Chicago and the state of Michigan. And there was a woman who came on board the plane who was obviously not feeling well. And this was when you were just starting to see the US begin to take this seriously. And some folks are wearing masks, some are not, but it's not a requirement yet. This is still very early on. And she came on board, took her seat, obviously struggling to breathe, and sitting directly across from me in the aisle. And immediately, I can remember having just all kinds of feelings coming up. I did not have anything to cover my face with. And I just remember feeling like super nervous about being in such close proximity with her. And there was like zero compassion in me in that moment. All I'm thinking about is myself. And I'm looking around, hopefully subtly, right, at some of the other people in the immediate vicinity. And I noticed that a lot of us felt that sense of nervousness, or at least appeared to. And as she would cough, I remember the gentleman sitting directly in front of her. It was almost like he would flinch every time she coughed. And eventually he pulled out something and put over his face, and he passed something else to his partner who was sitting across the aisle from him to cover her face as well. And I don't think the lady who was having trouble, I don't think that went unnoticed by her. And at one point, the flight attendant came, and I was under the impression that the flight attendant might ask her to move to the back of the plane. The plane was not crowded. But instead, the flight attendant offered water. And it was at that moment that I noticed truly the lack of compassion and how hyper-focused I had become on, how unfair it is that I have to be in such close proximity. And I began to feel a sense of shame in myself. I went ahead and put in my headphones and began listening to music and doing the things I normally might do. Flight takes off, I'm working on my laptop. And at some point I hear something drop to the floor, and I look and I notice that she had dropped the water she had been given, this bottle. And I had this moment where I had to decide, do I want to like reach down and pick this up? Because it was going to be a lot easier for me to do it than for her. But part of me also wanted to just pretend like I hadn't noticed. I had my headphones in. It would have been an easy way to get away with that. And I just had this realization that whatever I decide in that moment may very well reflect not only this momentary decision, but a decision that might speak and project a certain trajectory well into the future. Who am I going to be during this crisis? Who am I going to be during this pandemic? What am I going to prioritize? And I ultimately decided to pick it up, hand it back to her, doused my hands in sanitizer, and to an extent patted myself on the back in that moment, right? For being one of the good folks, right? And I continued to think about that for a long time, and it's actually what inspired the blog in the first place. And that felt, in retrospect, very easy. It felt like a no-brainer, but at the time, I caught myself being someone I did not necessarily want to be, or at least about to be someone I did not want to be. And one of the themes that has come up over and over again, and we see it play out in different ways, is how hardwired we are sometimes to move out of a space of fear. Fear is kind of our brain's default mechanism, and it plays out both as individual fear and collective fear and organizational fear. And so whether we're talking about the momentary decisions we might make about buying up all the hand sanitizer, buying all the toilet paper, or if we're talking about folks coming together for fear that their freedoms are being taken, as we've seen in Lansing more recently, right? There is a strong urge, and almost a default urge in a lot of us to hold a lot of anxiety, particularly when, as I said in the opening, right, when it goes from being a problem out there to something far more personal. It's easier to feel afraid for ourselves and our loved ones when we begin to see the people closest to us being more directly impacted by what's going on all around us. And so that individual decision to be afraid often translates into organizations and groups being afraid and making policies and procedures that reflect that fear. And so then I'm reminded of and want to call attention to what we're beginning to see around the exacerbation of disproportionate outcomes for the most vulnerable populations among us. That does not happen by coincidence. The individual becomes the collective, becomes the disproportionate outcome for whole populations. And so we see Black and brown folks disproportionately dying, disproportionately getting sick. People who live in environments where the air is more polluted are more susceptible to the impacts and the sicknesses that can accompany COVID-19. And so sometimes we can live with our fear and assume that maybe it's not hurting anyone to be afraid. But when we begin to hoard, when we begin to be a part of decision-making processes, and we're not taking the time to check our fears, and we allow ourselves to fall into default modes of operation, default 9 times out of 10 is going to equate to patriarchy. Default is going to equate to white supremacy, to homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. So these individual decisions have very real consequences for whole populations of people. And if we are not actively calling attention back on a continuous basis to who we're being and how we're showing up, then we are much more likely to do more harm to ourselves than good. And when things return to a sense of normalcy, whatever that means, we find that we're trying to pick up pieces. We're trying to compensate. We're trying to, oh, we got to figure out how to help this group or that group. And it's such an insidious and unnecessary step, for if we had called ourselves to account during the crisis, then we would not have to try to turn around and make up all the lost ground, right? Because the people we lose along the way, there's no making up for that. And it tends to be the same populations over and over again that are given the so-called short end of the stick, if you will, and made to carry the burden or the load for the rest of us. So I think centering and grounding is way more important in times of crisis than in any other, right? But it's easier said than done. And so as I move into closing, I wanted to just offer up a few reminders. I don't think I'm sharing anything that you don't already know, but just reminders around grounding. I was just yesterday actually reading a copy I have of the Tao, and right before going into meditation, I was called to the second stanza of the Tao, and I just wanted to share that with you and reflect on that just a little bit. It says, when people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. Being and non-being create each other. Difficult and easy support each other. Long and short define each other. High and low depend on each other. Before and after follow each other. Therefore, the master acts without doing anything and teaches without saying anything. Things arise and she lets them come. Things disappear and she lets them go. She has but doesn't possess, acts but doesn't expect. When her work is done, she forgets it. That is why it lasts forever. One of the reoccurring conversations I'm having with a friend of mine these days is mastery, right? What does it mean to work and move toward mastery? And should we be moving toward mastery? Because one of the points they often make is the idea that there's something that feels almost inhuman about moving toward mastery. We should be here for the full extent of the human experience. And that means the anger, the fear, the frustration that can come with just embodying this, right? This humanity that we share. And I'm of the opinion that I think it can be a both and, right? I don't think it has to be one or the other. I don't think any of us can escape our humanity. And I don't think that's the goal of mastery, is to escape it. I would argue that the goal of mastery is to become increasingly conscious about what we're choosing and who we're choosing to be at any given moment. So it's not that the master does not necessarily have fear. It's that the master is able to name it when it shows up and is able to make informed decisions as opposed to being dragged along by it. And I think that's a very important distinction to make. And so in offering some reminders around grounding and centering, I would say first, one of the key pieces is don't deny how you actually feel at any given moment. You're not going to be able to change it by pretending it's not there, right? And so when the fear comes, when the anxiety shows up, I don't think mastery is a lack of those things, right? I think mastery is being able to identify it for what it is when it arrives, and then making an informed decision about who you want to be in relationship to what you're feeling. I have been struggling to meditate lately. And what I realized just yesterday, the reminder that I received yesterday, is that you're not struggling to meditate, you're struggling to live into this idea of what you think meditation is supposed to be. And that's two very different things. So if you sit still and you feel like your mind is wandering, what the Buddhist tradition refers to sometimes as the monkey mind, right? The busy, hyperactive mind. Don't forget that part of the practice is making space for the monkey to be a monkey, right? Making space for the mind to be active and not feeling like you have to fight it and suppress it, but simply allowing whatever comes up to come up. And when it goes, to let it go, as the Tao just spoke to. There is no correct or right way to meditate. And the idea that I've been influenced so much by like these pop culture notions and narratives around what meditation has to look and feel like, that's the problem, right? That's the problem. And so I was thankful for that reminder, and pass it along to you all in the hopes that you find it useful and helpful. I want to be the type of person that's not easily shaken. I want to be the type of person that can just sit still for hours if the opportunity is there, and be unmoved and unafraid and forever centered. I would love to be that guy, but I'm not always that guy. More often than not, I'm not that guy. And so I think what is important for me, for all of us, is to be okay with that, to be okay with being a human being, to be okay with being afraid, of being frustrated, of losing my temper, of feeling stressed out because a lot of the things that I used to have access to, I no longer have access to. Some of the people in my life that I was able to count on, I can no longer count on them, right? Staying in place, sheltering in place. For some folks, not a problem. And for others, problematic. And for me, it's a little bit of both. Some days I'm digging it, love it. Other days it feels very difficult. And I think being able to acknowledge that is key, right? Another piece for that I want to offer for grounding and centering, I want to cite Matthew 18:3. Verily I say unto you, except ye be converted and become as little children, ye shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And I remember being a child and being somewhat confused about that offering. But as I've aged, the way I've come to hold that is to think about this in terms of awe and imagination. And call I was on a couple of weeks ago, someone offered what I thought was a very good prompt, right? Who could I be right now? How could I feel right now? Who could I be right now? How could I feel right now? And it was an offering, an invitation to lean into imagining myself a little bit better, imagining myself feeling more whole, more full. And I think if I can't start by envisioning something better than where I am at any given time, it's going to be mighty hard to get there, right? And so one of the things we often credit children for is being able to take in the little things, take in the little moments, to have some sense of awe and appreciation, but also imagination, being able to see beyond what's immediately in front of us, and to see something better, something bigger, something awe-inspiring. And it is indeed my hope for all of us that at various times on any given day, there is something in front of us that is indeed awe-inspiring. And I would invite all of us to look for that. Or as the old gospel song used to say, I'm looking for a miracle, right? I expect the impossible. I see the invisible. I feel the intangible. And so I would offer that if we're not looking for it, if we're not prioritizing it, it'll be all the more difficult to see. And so just a gentle reminder to put that in front of us whenever possible. I'm almost done. Next, you cannot control every aspect of this. You cannot control many aspects of this. Anxiety that can come up for a lot of us during this time, or even before this time, and especially during this time, is very real, and it has to be acknowledged where it exists. And again, I'm always encouraging all of us to engage in community where we can, because one of the greatest functions of community is to remind us and to hold us, right? And so hold dear to community, even when it's virtual, and be thankful that you have it when you do. And sometimes we can allow ourselves to feel a sense of isolation where we don't necessarily have to. And lastly, prioritize yourself, as I always say, right? We have the reflex, which needs to be understood. What is your default state? Take some time to try to figure that out. Am I typically anxious? Am I typically at ease? What is my default? Take some time and reflect on that, and then recalibrate if need be. Adjust accordingly to your values. If I understand that my default is fear, I can begin to take steps to try to recalibrate when I feel that fear coming to the surface. So I invite us all to remember the importance of reflection. In some ways, maybe even take advantage of the time to reflect that this current moment, that this crisis is giving us, and to find ways to recalibrate, to adjust, and to be who we want to be during this time. I thank you, as always, for giving me the opportunity to engage with you. And I really hope that what I've had to offer you find helpful. Thank you.